Hello, everyone, wherever you are. It's good to be back with you at our first program for 2025. It's a great opportunity to wish everyone a good year, hopefully better than the last year. But I think you all agree that all the indications are that it's going to be just as complex, just as challenging, although Israel does seem to have the upper hand strategically since September. But the challenges are multiplying as we speak. There's a whole series of terror attacks emanating from the West Bank. Situation in Syria, of course, is unclear. Situation in Lebanon is on tenterhooks. The ceasefire may or may not be expanded. The Lebanese army is not really performing as expected. The Kingdom of Jordan is under tremendous pressure and potentially long-term strategic threat, both from Syria, Iran, and elsewhere. The Houthis continue firing rockets at Israel every night or so. The Iranian nuclear issue is accelerating. It's good to see European leaders come out publicly and talk about snapback sanctions and what needs to be done, and waiting for the new administration to come in Washington. And on top of all of that, there's breaking news just about every moment about the possible hostage deal. And of course, we all hope and pray that Israeli hostages will be released soon and that somehow that square will be circled as well. This is all very complex, and that's before we talk about Russia and Turkey and Iran and their competition over Syria, Lebanon, the Saudis, normalization with Israel, and many, many, many issues on the table before the new administration comes in. And not clear at all what the Trump administration will pursue and when, and what the priorities will really be. So there's much to discuss today. And I would urge everyone to also follow the news in Europe, because Europe is obviously facing very, very significant headwinds, both hybrid warfare, conventional warfare with Russia and Iran behind Russia, populism, economic decline, demographic crisis, and on from there. So there's much on our agenda. But one thing is very clear, that Israel cannot, must not be isolated in the Middle East and in the world, and that Europe, as the largest bloc of democratic countries in the world, must be part of the alliance with Israel and vice versa. And this is why we're all here. And I want to, without further ado, go to Mark Sachs, our director in the Southeast, to introduce our excellent speaker today. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, David, and welcome everybody to 2025. There is nobody I'd rather kick off 2025 with than Jonathan Schanzer. So, John, welcome to ELNET's Monday briefing today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I can't imagine there are many on this call who don't know who you are. You're rather ubiquitous these days. But for their sake, I'm still going to introduce you. So, formerly known as Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, John is the executive director of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. John previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he followed and froze the funding of Hamas and Al-Qaeda. He has held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. He has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East and U.S. national security. He is the author of 4 books. He's often seen on major news outlets providing analysis, and he hosts the FDD Morning Brief with Jonathan Schanzer Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8:30 a.m. Nice plug for Jonathan. So, John, welcome again.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
All right. So, to conclude 2024, we had Yaakov Katz on. And I remember Yaakov saying to me quite impactfully, if anybody had asked me at the beginning of 2024, if at the end of 2024, I thought the following, and he listed a number of things, such as that Netanyahu would be stronger at the end of 2024 than he was at the beginning of 2024, that Hamas and Hezbollah would be decapitated, figuratively and literally, that Iran's cloak of invincibility would be shattered, leaving it more vulnerable than any time in recent memory, and that to cap the whole year off, Assad would flee for Russia, leaving Syria in the hands of former Jabhat al-Nusra terrorist who seems to have discarded the Quran for the Federalist Papers. Now, that last part is me, not Yaakov, but I still think that kind of reflects what we're thinking these days. So before we look forward, I would love to get your reflections on 2024. And if you could, what do you think are going to be the most consequential events of 2024 that we're going to see their effects in 2025?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark and David, and to everyone at ELNET. We very much value your partnership here at FTD, and certainly want to encourage you to keep up the good work. 2024 was a remarkable year, as you suggest. A lot of things that I did not have on my bingo card. I did expect the collapse of Hamas, and we are still, of course, watching this terror group in decline. It is interesting, of course, to note that they are still somehow able to recruit more fighters to their ranks, even as they collapse. That I also did not expect, and these were headlines that we saw at the end of last year and just over the last couple of days. The collapse of Hezbollah was by far the thing that shocked me the most. We had been briefed by the Israeli security establishment for years, where they were warning that this was a military force in the Middle East, and a non-state military force that was equal in power to that of a mid-sized European country. So think like the military of the Czech Republic or something along those lines. The fact that Hezbollah collapsed in the way that it did was a testament to Israel's incredible intelligence collection and its ability to integrate that intelligence with daring operations along the lines of what we saw with the Beeper operation, otherwise known as Operation from the Liver to the Knee. I would say that was probably the biggest shock for the analyst class here in Washington. The fall of the Assad regime was, of course, also shocking, but really just more in its speed. I don't think anybody ever expected that the Assad regime was going to be able to hold on forever. They had been gutted out by friends and foes alike. Both Al-Qaeda and ISIS had really eroded its strength from within, but also so did Iran and Hezbollah. Ironically, they actually left the regime as a shell of its former self, leaving it very vulnerable to what happened. I would say that the rise of Turkey as a new power in the Middle East, not shocking in the sense that I think we always understood that Turkey had these aspirations, but the rapid nature of its ability to conquer Syria by way of proxy through HTS, as it's known, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that was surprising. And I think that's one to watch for this coming year. And then, of course, the last major surprise was how weak Iran was at the end of the day. That Israel, after being provoked far too many times, Israel took matters into its own hands, flew several dozen, perhaps even 100 jets across the skies of the Arabian Peninsula and proceeded to knock out just about all, if not all, of Iran's air defense systems, those Russian-made S-300s. By the way, the Russians are not likely going to be selling a huge amount of defense industry equipment in 2025. I think they have lost a lot of credibility. That was another thing that I probably wouldn't have predicted last year, that they just are unable to defend skies with those S-300s. That's not going to help sell them a lot of equipment in the future. But Iran now is without its air defenses, and it's also without the ability to build out its ballistic missile production program. So it's quite limited right now. And so as a result, we're actually watching the Iranians deliver ballistic missiles in whole or in part to the Houthis. And that is the proxy through which they have decided to attack Israel. And the Israelis have some pretty significant choices to make as far as that's concerned. As you know, in terms of your question about what I look for 2025, I mean, I would say, first of all, let's keep an eye on the Houthis. They are the last hot front fighting against Israel right now. All the others have essentially gone quiet. I mean, maybe you could say the West Bank remains a challenge too. But this war by proxy that Iran is waging, it's unsustainable. The Israelis continue to expend $1 million+ interceptors to knock down those ballistic missiles as they come in. That's expensive, and that's even before Israel has to scramble, let's say, a couple of dozen jets, fly across the Arabian Peninsula and bomb Yemen. That cannot continue in the way that we're watching it now, not from the Israeli perspective. And so I suspect the Israelis are going to try to force the issue. I would also note, though, that with a change of administration, we could see different policies as it relates to the Houthis. The Trump administration, as we all know, had designated the Houthis as a terror organization in the final days of that single Trump term. And then the Biden administration delisted the Houthis, making it now something of a partisan issue. The Trump administration will likely add it back. I would imagine that's probably an immediate thing that we'll see. But that's bureaucratic in nature. The question is whether the Trump administration decides to take further steps and to perhaps cobble together a coalition that would finally defeat the Houthis and free up the Red Sea from the terror that the Houthis have imposed on maritime shipping there, all but shutting down 10 or 12% of maritime trade in this key waterway. But I think the big issue that we're all watching at FTD, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who knows FTD's work, we are watching the potential for Iran to break out with a nuclear weapon. We know that the regime is weak. We know that it is isolated right now. It looks like it is reeling. It has lost its ring of fire, as it's known. It's lost its network of proxies. When we talk about Hamas or Hezbollah or the Assad regime, Iraqi militias have largely gone quiet. The only one, again, that we've mentioned that's still left and that is active, that's the Houthis. And so the Houthis, that's not a strategy that's sustainable for the regime. And so they may be thinking about a breakout for a nuke as a means to strengthen themselves immediately and irrevocably. Now, the U.S., the Biden administration, the Israelis continue to watch Iran very carefully. They're watching the regime as it relates to that nuclear file. But this will be, I think, the big question for this year, whether Iran decides to take that fateful step and thereby may evoke a significant response from the Israelis, perhaps even from the U.S. So this is a major issue to watch. Last thing I'll just note, Mark, is the alliance of states that I think has gone largely unnoticed by observers, right? Russia and Iran and China and perhaps even North Korea working together as an axis. This is, even as we've watched multiple fronts erupt across the world in 2024, we still are watching the political sort of chattering classes of Europe and the United States ignoring the very existence of this axis. There needs to be a better understanding this year, I think, of the forces that have gathered in an effort to undermine the US-led world order, to undermine the rules-based world order. Israel's war with Iran is part of that, but so is Ukraine, and Taiwan may follow. South Korea may be part of that as well. This is something that we're also going to have to continue to monitor here and hopefully to exhort the West to come together, perhaps with some of these changing leaders, changing coalitions in the West. Perhaps that will lend itself to a new political constellation of Western European and US aligned countries.
So you just proved a simple question does not beget a simple answer.
Oh no,
There's
never.
a lot
not
to
in this
unpack
environment.
A lot to unpack. So let's start with the Houthis. Interestingly enough, I wasn't expecting to go there, but it seems like a lot of roads do run through Yemen. So if we package Yemen and Iran together, at the beginning of the Biden administration, there was a war going on between the Saudis and Yemen, the Houthis. So that was their front. Right now, they've been rather quiet. The Houthis are making a big mess of, as you said, international shipping, the southern part of the Middle East. You're no fan of Qatar, as we know. There was also a big boycott between the UAE, I think it was Saudi Arabia, and Qatar not too long ago. So if we look forward, there's this realignment. There should be a natural realignment of countries. And I think you and FDD are as well versed in the Abraham Accords countries as any organization. What sense do you get that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain are willing to take on more responsibility for the nefarious activities, the disabling activities of the Houthis, recognizing as well their staunch enemy, Iran, serves as puppeteer to the Houthis? Is that a clear
interesting
question?
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark. We're not seeing a lot of will on the part of these Gulf Arab states. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one is that these Gulf states are traditionally pretty skittish. These are not profiles in courage. They don't have particularly powerful militaries, nor are they particularly adept or professional. Now, that is, I think, exacerbated by the fact that there was a time where the Yemenis, or rather the Houthis, were coming under attack by both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Those military campaigns were cut short by the United States because of the errors that were made on the battlefield. Buses were getting hit, civilians were being killed. And there came a point where the U.S. called upon Saudi Arabia to halt all of this activity. Now, that also coincided with the Jamal Khashoggi affair, where the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was implicated in the murder of a U.S. resident and a contributing writer to the Washington Post. That did not play well here in the U.S. So between the two of those, the errant campaigns plus the Khashoggi affair, we really began to see significant tensions creep in to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and the Houthis were a big part of that. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why we've seen the Houthis become something of a partisan wedge issue. The Biden administration was particularly critical. The Trump administration came out and sort of was perhaps a bit more understanding of the Saudi position and the Emirati position. Today, we see very little interest on the part of any of these countries taking it to the Houthis. They are the natural enemies of the Houthis. They are the natural parties that should be deployed because they have that immediate presence along the border with Yemen, and yet we're not seeing it. Now, some of that, I think, could change with the Trump administration coming in. Trump has the trust of the Saudis and the Emiratis, for that matter. I think we could potentially see a realignment in a redeployment, if you will, of some of those natural allies of the United States in countering the Houthis. We've seen, by the way, in recent days that there may be some movement on the part of the Egyptians. This is a fascinating development. The Egyptians have lost something like $7 or more billion in trade because of the Houthis shutting down that Red Sea corridor. The Egyptians, of course, they're bringing in those funds by way of the Suez Canal, where they're able to tax the vessels that come through the Suez. So they have reportedly, possibly, been preparing for a military campaign to strike the Houthis. This would be significant because the Egyptians are they are in possession of a pretty significant amount of hardware produced here in the United States. We don't see the Egyptians use it, rarely, if at all, But this could be, I think, a pretty positive development. But the big thing, actually, in my view, is this question of whether the Trump administration will be able to pull together a new coalition under what we had called the Abraham Accords. Maybe we call it something else, but it's about actually mobilizing the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, maybe Jordan, maybe Egypt, and including the Saudis to finally do what's necessary here. This idea of creating a Middle East NATO of sorts, a Middle East security alliance, is I think the term that the Trump administration had used, a MESA, with the idea of, finally putting the security of the Middle East in the hands of the pragmatic actors and allies of the United States.
So what are you seeing and hearing from UAE and some of the other Abraham Accord countries that you like? And we just said what we're not seeing. And what are some things outside the context of taking action against the Houthis that you would like them to take?
Well, look, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that, the good news is that the Abraham Accords have held. The UAE is still maintaining its alliance with Israel. The Bahrainis are still maintaining their alliance with Israel. The Moroccans still have their alliance. That one's been a little more dicey, but it's been okay. The countries that I've been actually a bit more concerned about are Jordan and Egypt. Jordan, we've seen just horrific rhetoric coming out of Ayman al-Safadi, the foreign minister, but also from the Queen, from the King himself. And we're seeing a whole lot of smuggling coming into Israel from Jordan. That is typically stuff that's been smuggled into Jordan by way of Syria. And it'll be very interesting to see whether that smuggling continues after the fall of the Assad regime. Right now, we're not getting a lot of clear sort of answers coming out of the Jordanians or the Israelis about the volume of that smuggling since the fall of Assad at the end of last year. On Egypt, it's going to be interesting. I'd welcome the action against the Houthis if that's what they're inclined to do. But in the meantime, we are keenly aware of the fact that tunnels did exist and may still exist along the Philadelphia corridor. The Egyptians have been howling about Israel's presence there, even as that has done a huge amount to cut down on the smuggling. Whereas before we were watching weapons and weapon systems and fighters go through tunnels between Gaza and Sinai. We're now seeing that the smugglers are relegated to bringing small drones to the border and then trying to deploy them into Gaza with just small arms and ammo. That seems to be a good development as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to see more from there. But the real key, Mark, the big thing that we're all watching is whether the Saudis join. The Saudis are the big prize here. And on that, I got to say, I'm still not convinced. There was a time, I think, where I was very optimistic, sanguine about the prospect. But if you recall, in April of 2023, the Saudis enter into some kind of a deal brokered by the Chinese with Iran. And so there was some kind of a trilateral understanding, the need to respect each other's sovereignty is the way that they put it. The terms of that deal were never made public. We still don't understand exactly what the Saudis got in exchange for an agreement with Iran that saw the end of Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia. I'm concerned that the Saudis may have given up too much or accepted terms that would have put our interests, American interests, Western interests at risk. But this is something that we're going to have to continue to watch because Donald Trump will be the kind of person that changes the dynamic in the region. And so we're just going to have to wait and see what the terms are that he brings to the table. We understand that there could be some kind of security guarantee that the U.S. puts on the table. There could be even efforts to allow the Saudis to enrich uranium in small amounts on Saudi soil. These are not necessarily things that I endorse or recommend, but these are things that are in fact on the table, or at least have been reported to be put on the table.
Well, in 2023, Iran was still a strong horse. Now it's a horse sent to the glue factory potentially. So do you think there's a little buyer's remorse if that is the case from Iran, that they may want to rethink the type of arrangement they make?
No, absolutely. I think that the collapse of Iran militarily, the fact that it sustained that strike in late October from the Israelis that knocked out the air defenses, knocked out the ballistic missile production capabilities, the fact that the Assad regime has collapsed, the fact that Hamas seems to really be limping at this point, that Hezbollah is a hot mess. All of these things, I think, are probably giving the Arab states, the Sunni Arab states, perhaps all the Middle East for that matter, pause, right? That they have to wonder at this point whether they should be fearful of the Iranian regime any longer. Maybe this is the time for them, and at least in their minds, to come back to the fold with the United States. It didn't look pretty there for a while. The U.S. did not have, I think, a lot of clarity in this war over the last 15 months, but the Israelis took the initiative. It was the Israelis that I would argue that have largely won this war. It's not over yet, but certainly the Israelis have come out with a significant advantage while they still try to mop up in Gaza and they still have to address the threat from the Houthis. But by and large, the Iranian threat has dissipated significantly. And I do think that provides an opening for these Sunni Arab states to say, okay, you know what? We want to be part of this defense architecture. The CENTCOM missile defense that has worked for Israel, the American-made weaponry, modified, of course, to some extent by the Israeli military, that has also done the trick, that the Israelis have been able to use F-16s and F-35s to fly into enemy airspace and to defeat a foe that was at one point believed to be far more powerful. So all of that, I think, probably lends itself to the specter of a new alliance of sorts, but a lot of that will really hinge on the next couple of weeks as the Biden administration wraps things up, hopefully without much incident, and then the Trump team comes in, and that's, I think, where the interesting work will begin.
Before I ask my next question, I want to remind everybody, feel free to ask a question, send it in to the link that Randy's going to put up there again, and we will get to those questions near the end. All right, so John, let's turn to Turkey. You have long, for as long as I can remember, been a skeptic of Erdogan, president of Turkey. You certainly are vindicated in having those beliefs for so long. I can name some others who may be questioning what they were thinking for a long period of time. But let's start with where you think Erdogan's path takes him in the foreseeable future. And how do you square where he wants to go with the ambitions of Europe, Israel, and the United States and our goals for the Middle East?
Well, look, maybe it just helps for just 2 minutes to review where Turkey has been, because I think this is really important. In my mind, it begins in 2009. Erdogan shows up at Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum and slams Shimon Peres, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, for effectively being a murderer. The following year, we see Erdogan support the flotilla that was designed to break the Israeli blockade of the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. 2011, the Arab Spring breaks out, and Turkey becomes a sponsor of just about every Muslim Brotherhood movement in the region, from Libya to Syria and beyond. We also see the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap, which sees the release of 1,000+ Hamas prisoners, many of whom decide to move to Turkey, where they establish a headquarters. And Turkey has been a large Hamas headquarters now for more than a decade. In the rise of ISIS, we saw the Turks facilitating the movement of ISIS fighters across its border to cross into Syria and into Iraq to wage war on behalf of the Islamic State. Meanwhile, the Turks were also selling ISIS oil, selling antiquities, just a disaster, really, in terms of undermining Western foreign policy. And that comes alongside a massive sanctions busting scheme that the Turks facilitated on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran, moving $20 billion illicitly in cash and gold on behalf of the Iranian regime. Over the years, we've seen that support for Hamas only grow. The rhetoric of Erdogan has been horrific. By the way, they also acquired the Russian S-400 air defense system, which was in direct violation of their NATO ally obligations. All of this really comes together to paint a horrific picture of the regime in Turkey. This is an anti-democratic, pro-terrorist, extremist government that is a thorn in the side of NATO. And it really, I think, at this point raises significant questions about what Europe, the United States, the NATO alliance in general, what they plan to do with Turkey. As we know, there's no mechanism for removing a NATO ally from the alliance. And that's, I think, a huge problem for all of NATO right now, as they now grapple not only with that history that I've just reviewed of a decade and a half of Turkish malign activity, but now we've got the Turks being the primary patrons for HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, otherwise known as the Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate group that has just conquered Syria with the help of Turkey. So the Turks have gained power, and they continue to play a role in support of extremist movements across the region. And the West finds itself at a crossroads. Now, I have not seen a whole lot of clarity coming out of Europe so far. I certainly haven't seen much clarity coming out of the US. Everyone seems to be wanting to wait and see what happens with HTS and the new rulers of Syria. People don't want to jump to conclusions. Some are saying that it was a good thing that Assad fell, and that we are only going to see improvements in terms of this new regime in Syria. I got to say, I am not particularly optimistic that peace is going to break out as a result of HTS taking over Syria. I do think it's probably wise to wait to see what Turkey's role is, to see what HTS's government looks like before we'd make any moves, positive or negative. There are those right now that are calling for all of the sanctions on the regime in Syria to be lifted in an acknowledgement of the new regime that has stepped in. I don't believe that removing sanctions on this regime, given its al-Qaeda roots, makes a lot of sense right now. My sense is we should just wait and watch, and perhaps in another 6 months or a year, if we truly see policies that that are more aligned with the United States, with Europe, with the West, then perhaps we can start down that path.
So let's talk about Ahmed al-Sharaa, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who is the leader of HTS. He seems to be the new James Madison of Syria. Is it Takia or is it legit? I mean, how do you look at him, and where do you think?
Yeah, look, I don't know how to see him in any other light than to say that he is a man who was instrumental in the creation of al-Qaeda in Syria, the Nusra Front. He had an alliance with ISIS. He broke that alliance with ISIS. He once wore Islamic garb. Now he wears Western garb. Will the real Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani please stand up? I think we just don't know. I will say, though, that, when you talk about the name of his organization and his name, it's important to understand here, when we talk about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're talking about the Front for the Liberation of the Levant. Al-Sham means Levant. What they're talking about is not just Syria. They're talking about all of the Levant, which would include Jordan and Israel as well. And then you look at his kunya, at his nickname in Arabic, Abu Muhammad, the father of Muhammad, al-Jawlani, from the Golan. This man is invoking symbolism, right, that is militaristic in nature, irredentist in nature. This is something that I think, for whatever reason, folks aren't focusing on this right now. That's fine. If you want to say we want to wait and see how he performs, that's okay. But let's just be clear. Right now, there is a big charm offensive being waged by this new Syrian government. They were in Qatar. I think today I believe they're in, maybe they were in Jordan en route to to the UAE. And the goal right now, at least with the three countries they've been visiting in the Arab world, is pressure to be brought to bear on the United States to lift all sanctions and to give them the funds that they seek in order to govern. I got to say, once again, premature to do that right now, especially when dealing with an Al Qaeda affiliate and a man who's got blood on his hands.
So we're getting a bunch of questions, which is no surprise, or should be no surprise. But first, I'm going to offer a very brief ELNET commercial. For everybody, I would like to invite everybody to join us at this year's 2025 ELNET's International Policy Conference in Paris, May 18th through 20th for Diplomacy Club members. If you would like to join us and are not a Diplomacy Club member, there's an easy remedy. Become a Diplomacy Club member, and we will see you there in May. You can go to our website. You could sign up. It is going to be a way to hear from policy influencers from all across Europe, Israel, and including the United States, as well as policymakers, to hear be front and center to hear what is taking place as policy discussions are conducted between policy influencers, political leaders, between Israel and Europe. So with that, let's get to some of the questions, Jonathan. I'm going to start with John Mirish. He wants to know what your prediction is about a potential expansion. You sort of addressed it, but let's delve more deeply into it. What you think the expansion of the Abraham Accords, and how would that change the equation in the region? And how do we sideline Qatar and stop its attempts to spread radical Islam throughout the world? So that's a two-part question.
Yeah, look, in terms of the expansion of the Abraham Accords, it all comes down to Saudi. If you see the Saudis make this move, then I think it becomes inevitable that other countries in the region follow suit, and perhaps even countries outside of the region, Muslim countries in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, East Asia, right? You can imagine Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country, following in the footsteps of Saudi Arabia. This would be a game changer, and would potentially put Israel in a better position vis-a-vis the entire OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That would be a big boost for Israel, and we would see, I think, the potential in the Arab world, again, for that Middle East Security Alliance. We could see energy policy streamlined. We could see air defenses better integrated with CENTCOM and with other allies. It would be a game changer. It truly would. But a lot of this really does hinge on the Israelis walking away with a victory, bringing an end to all of the conflicts. So that would be Gaza, it would be Lebanon, it would be Yemen. All of that is going to be necessary, I think, in order to be able to start to move forward. I think watching a diplomatic process play out while a war is ongoing just seems to me unlikely at this moment, even with Trump coming in. And that may be one of the reasons, by the way, that we're watching Hamas drag its feet on a hostage deal, knowing that if they quit, that means that all the other Iranian proxies will also quit, and that will open up the door to that realignment that Hamas likely thought it was thwarting back on October 7th when it launched its assault on Israel. It did bring a halt to the Saudi-Israel peace or normalization talks that were ongoing at the time. That was probably the most successful thing from Hamas's perspective that they were able to pull off. And if they relent now, we're likely back to the future, so to speak, where normalization is back on the table. As for the Qataris, the influence of Qatar in the Middle East, in the United States, in Europe, is unmistakable. This is an extremist government masquerading as a legitimate player, a legitimate investor in Western business interests, in Western government interests. I continue to be very alarmed at the investments that the Qataris are making in the public sectors of the United States and of Europe, putting money in education, putting money in municipal infrastructure. They are now really, they're buying influence in ways that extend well beyond the purchase of Harrods department stores or soccer clubs in Europe. These were always investments that were designed to bolster the image of this tiny, corrupt Gulf state that controls something like 10 to 15% of all of the world's energy resources. They have bottomless wealth, and it was one thing to be buying up top brands around the country. It's another thing when they sponsor the congressional baseball game here in Washington, or they put money into the education systems of school districts that are struggling to make ends meet. Their influence, the Qatari influence, is now seen across the US, across the West. These are Muslim Brotherhood supporters. They are Hamas supporters. They are Taliban supporters. They have been known to support and finance Al Qaeda and ISIS. And they have access to governments around the world, and they're influencing governments around the world. This is, I would argue, probably one of the greatest challenges that has gone unnoticed in the West, unnoticed in Europe. It's not a kinetic threat. It doesn't rise to the alarm that we feel when looking at, Iran, for example, and all of its proxies, or Russia. It has been operating under the radar. And that's something that has to change, because that money continues to pour in, the influence continues to get bought, and no one seems to be doing anything about it.
So on that, let's explore that a moment further, because you said operating under the radar. Now, I can understand why any country, any organization operates with their own self-interest in mind. Can't blame them. That's what they expect to do. The question here, and Gary Lazar raises this as well, is this hasn't been under the radar for the U.S. security agencies. And it hasn't been under the radar, I can't imagine, for the U.S. government and for those that follow the Middle East. So the real question here, I think, is why has the United States been so reluctant to take on, and I know you've been banging this drum for a long time, so why has the United States, its security agencies and all appropriate regulatory agencies been so reluctant to take on Qatar?
It's a good question, and I'll try to sum it up. It's money and energy. The Qataris continue to provide a huge amount of natural gas. Again, they produce something like 10, 12, 15% of the world's energy. And so we need them. Actually, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration rushed to forge a major non-NATO ally relationship with the Qataris, primarily because of the concern about energy flows. The Qataris also have invested billions of dollars in the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the base that is home to our Combined Air Operations Center, CAOC. And so this is our forward base in the Middle East. The Pentagon does not want to give up on that. That is an expenditure that they would rather not have to pay by moving to another country. But again, the Qataris continue to buy influence here in the United States at the local, at the state, and at the federal level, making it that much harder for anyone to put any distance between us and the Qataris. I think that if you really begin to scratch a little bit beneath the surface, it becomes very clear who the Qataris are and why they're dangerous. There's no reason that this tiny, corrupt country should have billions and billions of dollars invested in our education system at the higher ed level, or even at the K through 12 level, Why they are doing this is, I think, in my mind, quite clear. They're looking to buy influence. But when that kind of money is sloshing around, it becomes very difficult for politicians to step up and do the right thing at any level. And so the Qataris, in my view, we need to address Qatari investment in the United States in the same way that we look at Russian or Chinese investments. We have something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is an interagency working group that looks at foreign investments that could threaten American interests. Why we do that with the Chinese and with the Russians and even sometimes with allies like the UAE, but we don't do it with the Qataris, makes no sense to me. And I think we need to have more more disclosure, more revelations about what Qatar has been doing. And by the way, for those who are not aware, what is invested here in the US is just a fraction of what has been invested around the world. Where you go to UK, France, Germany, you see a massive amount of Qatari investment there as well. This has to raise the question, what are the Qataris doing with that influence? What have they won in all of these countries by throwing so much money at their governments? What have they gained from this? That's the question that has yet to be answered in most of these countries, and that is truly what bothers me.
Disconcerting, at the very least. Maria Ponsillo, this is a little outside your expertise, but I'm confident you can still answer it. And if Maria is interested, we are going to have Natasha Hausdorff on next week, who is well suited to address the question about lawfare. But this is in the context of lawfare. So could you talk about the impact of lawfare in Israel, the global delegitimization, demonization, and double standards that we saw applied at the ICC, the ICJ, most recently at the UN, and more recently, the claims filed against IDF soldiers in nearly a dozen countries. Can you talk about what you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I am not a specialist in lawfare. We at FTD, we've got my colleague Ord Kittry, who literally wrote the book on lawfare, published by Oxford University Press. Gosh, it was probably almost 10 years ago now, but that book still holds up. You get a sense of what that game plan is, and it's a system. It's the tyranny of the majority, right? Where Israel is, is ostracized at the UN. The non-aligned countries, the OIC countries, they've ganged together, they've joined a coalition. Their numbers make it such that at the General Assembly and in a bunch of other UN agencies, Israel is the odd man out, and they continue to wage this campaign to demonize Israel, to prevent it from being able to defend itself by engaging in this lawfare, by making their self-defense deemed to be illegal according to these agencies. It puts an immense amount of strain on Israel. Look, I will say that the Israelis seem to have done a pretty good job, at least so far, in throwing enough lawyers and legal experts. Not surprising that the Israelis have that kind of brain power that they're able to harness. And so they're fighting back, but it's one more area. I mean, I've looked at the different fronts that Israel fights on, and everybody talks about, the primary 7 kinetic fronts, but then there's the media front, and there's the campus front, and there's cyber, and there's lawfare, right? I mean, it's one front after another, and the goal has been to weaken Israel, to exhaust Israel, to make it spread thin on multiple fronts. And the lawfare front is one such front. I will say that one of the areas that I've been particularly interested in is if you look at that ICJ filing, it came out of South Africa. South Africa is an interesting country to me because they have become, at least in my mind, they've become major facilitators for Hamas. Not unlike Qatar, not unlike Turkey. I actually lump them in among the axis of Hamas support that we've seen emerge worldwide. Look, the South Africans have been hollowed out in a process that we often refer to as state capture. their institutions have been gutted by non-state actors, crime families, and the like. But we're now also seeing Iran and Qatar and others making significant investments in that country as a means to use that country to weaponize lawfare. And so that's one to watch in 2025, what we learn about South Africa. This is actually going to be the focus of some of FTD's work this year.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to foreign aid, there's a strong argument right there that if we don't fill some of the vacuums, others will. And we tend to lose our foreign policy bona fides if others are filling the vacuums. Susan Wagner, let's visit. I want to go back to Turkey. Susan asks a great question. Given Turkey's activities within Syria, what do you think are going to happen to the Kurds right now? From what I understand, Kurds control roughly 40% of Syria, a lot of the natural reserves. What do you think will happen to the Kurds, and what do you think the relationship between Israel and the Kurds will look like over the next year?
Well, in Israel, it's interesting, but we're now seeing at least some Israeli politicians. I think notably right now, Gideon Sa'ar has come out and stated the importance of protecting the Kurds and working with the Kurds. I think the Israelis, I think, justifiably see the Kurds as being important to maintaining a modicum of stability in the country. But I do think that the Turks are going to be they're going to try to undermine the Kurdish controlled areas. Now, I think it's important to note that there are some legitimate threats to Turkey that exist within Syria as well as in Iraq and elsewhere. The PKK, as it's known, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and their Syrian affiliate known as the YPG. They are legitimate threats, one could say, to Turkish national security. But, in the same way that Israel is required to wage pinpoint campaigns against terrorist groups, this is what the world needs to be demanding from the Turks right now. That Turkey should not be bombing Kurdistan wholesale. And they need to be very careful, by the way, because there are hundreds of ISIS prisoners being held in Kurdistan. If they are able to somehow break out of jail, that could mean total chaos for Syria if some of the more hardened ISIS fighters are allowed to integrate back into Syria. That's something to watch for. But I'm concerned about the welfare of the Kurdish populations and their ability to maintain territory. It doesn't need to be sovereign, but to maintain autonomy, I think, is crucial given the history of the Kurds, a terrible history of mistreatment in the region against this embattled minority.
30 million Kurds without an autonomous zone that's truly theirs, or without a state. It's rather sad. I'm going to go over to Larry Hochberg, and we're going to return to Iran. ELNET has long championed across Europe, making IRGC designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. What else would you recommend? What are some policy issues that you think we should, or we as that should be considered? I don't want to. Sorry, sure. I'm struggling here because I want to make sure that we're not lobbying. So I just want to talk about on big issues. What are some of the big issues you think outside of an IRGC designation as a terrorist organization is something that should be front and center for Europeans?
Well, I mean, look, there are a number of things that I think are kind of basic. I mean, one is blocking some of Iran's key banks and businesses from the banking system. And there, we look at at one point, we were looking at some of these banks being cut off from the US-led SWIFT system, the SWIFT banking messaging system. There's also Target 2, which is the euro-based system. Target 2 is something that I have not heard anybody talk about in quite some time, but that is the European analog to SWIFT, and that could be significant. there is, obviously snapback. If we begin to see evidence of the Iranians making, moves to build out that nuclear weapon, you have the ability to reimpose all of the previous sanctions that had been placed on Iran and its and all the mechanisms that have funded the regime. So that's something that's possible. But I think the big issue is one that I think it's right in front of our noses. It's something that FTD has talked about for a long time now, and I certainly am not hearing anything out of Europe in this regard. And that is primarily that the people of Iran are willing partners with the West to help bring down the regime. The people of Iran hate this regime more than the United States, more than Europe. They truly detest the people that have run their country into the ground. And so, with a bit of support, rhetorical support is just the beginning. Financial support, technological support, communications, intelligence, all of these things, this is something that if the EU decided to do and to provide the responsible opposition in Iran with at least some of this help, it could actually begin to bring down the regime. And with additional support from the U.S., additional support from the Israelis, the Saudis, from Azerbaijan, for that matter. I mean, there's a whole coalition of countries that I think would be eager to work against this regime by providing support to those that stand against it. You can do all of that without having to engage in the complexities of the sanctions or of military operations. Those things may at one point become necessary, but there are a whole bunch of things that we've not tried yet as a means to organically bring down this regime and to support the people of Iran.
Well, John, that brings us to the end. Before we formally conclude, I'd like to welcome Tom Flesch, ELNET's chair, to say a few words. Before he does, John, I just want to say great conversation. As promised, it was a terrific way to kick off 2025. You gave everybody on this call something to think about. I would love to have you back in the future.
My pleasure.
With that, Tom Flesch.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for doing a wonderful interview. And Jonathan, fabulous information. I look forward to the next conversation. I just want to make a quick point. And the quick point is that we have a lot of challenges ahead, for sure. We can be concerned that, things develop as you talked about, the new administration. But one of the things that is really gratifying to me is that in newspaper reports, in the New York Times, or in different reports in the newspapers, especially dealing with the beepers and that whole situation, there were references to the United States and the allied countries in Europe all along the way with the Israelis planning all this whole movement with the Mossad. And it gratified me to see that there is cooperation. And the cooperation from Europe, I attribute a lot to the work of ELNET. And I thank everybody who supports us and everybody that will support us. And I think that we are going into a very positive time in the future. So I'm optimistic. I know there are challenges, but I'm still very optimistic that the work that we're doing is, in fact, giving results. So thank you to everybody and best wishes in the new year for everything good.
Thank you, Tom. All right, everybody, enjoy your day. And we'll see you next week with Natasha Hausdorff, who is a renowned expert on international law and national security. Invitations will go out shortly. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks again, John.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. It was great.